So welcome everybody. This is our title for today, the affordability crisis. Who is affected and why it's happening? Those questions or answers are not as completely obvious as one might think from what we hear on the news. So today, of course, we have Alan with us. This is the fourth in our and last in our series of four on big issues, big topics in community development. You'll find others posted probably at our website. And we're really excited to have Alan with us again here today. So before I turn him loose on you all, I'm going to just cover my brief explanation of middle neighborhoods. We are a national initiative that is basically focused on mobilizing attention toward the disappearance of middle neighborhoods in America. And this is happening either through decline or gentrification. What we do with our time, we're mostly volunteers, but this is a coordinated effort by NCST and NeighborWorks America. Oh, hey, Candy Airs. And we do it through the community of practice. And that is who is sponsoring this webinar right now. We do regularly scheduled webinars. We do an occasional newsletter, best practices, things like that. We support policy, inquiries in terms of providing data and researchers as well. There is a research function and policy analysis and communications that's mostly handled at NCST. And again, we're trying to raise awareness. So, if we would be very happy if all cities were tracking their middle neighborhoods and maintaining an awareness of where they've been, where they're headed, and what they're facing right now. So our next slide is what is a middle neighborhood? It is, we don't have any hard and fast metrics for this, but they are, if you think about your community, neither the healthiest nor are they the most distressed neighborhoods in your community. They're those that were built largely with single family homes for families with children at the time they were built. They tend to be still well more than 50% owner occupied, but they were very likely more like 90% owner occupied when they were first built. The housing stock is aging. This is a critical factor. It's still in generally acceptable condition, but it often lacks the features and updates that would allow it to compete well for today's home buyers. And because it's so hard to rehab a home or update it, and by hard, I mean, finding the contractors, the financing, all of the fragmented services one needs, that tends to be a challenge to get those properties back into shape for the next generation. What I love about middle neighborhoods is that they tend to be more racially, ethnically, and economically diverse. They are those mixed income, mixed ethnicity and race and age communities that we're all trying to achieve when we're working in more distressed neighborhoods. So they're worth preserving. So that's middle neighborhoods. Today, as I said, we have Alan Mallach with us again. He's the senior fellow at the Center for Community Progress. I wanted you to make note of his Substack, the Sapiens Project. It's a great Substack, and he's actually just kicked off what I think you said in the first post is going to be a series on this topic we're talking about today, right, Alan?
That's right. I'm going to do probably over the next month or so. We started last week, and over the next month or so, I'm going to have 4 or 5 posts on different specific issues associated with the whole housing affordability crisis and trying to challenge some of the conventional wisdom about it.
Very interesting. I just read the first one. Very interesting. But go back and I think I missed something. Go back to that last slide. Oh, just communityprogress.org is the website for the organization for which Alan is senior fellow. It's a fantastic organization that really handles this whole track of local and state policy issues more than I would say any other organization in our field. And there's just so much content and interesting, um, useful stuff that is not what you get from um, your average CDC support organizations. Okay. So we also want to point out that the registration is open for Reclaiming Vacant Properties 2026, which is the keystone event for Center for Community Progress. They do it every 18 months or so. And that's going to be in Pittsburgh in September. So don't miss it. And our agenda for today is just to do these, welcome and introductions. I'm going to have Alan do his presentation, and then we'll have plenty of time for audience discussion. Well, today we'll have a little shorter time than usual because there's a lot of content in this presentation. I've had a preview of the slide deck, and it is really amazing. And wanted to assure you that you'll get links to the slide deck after this because you're all going to want to be able to look at these charts and graphs and use them in your own work as well, I'm sure. So, Alan, I forgot to say today, our international thought leader, thank you for being with us again. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Marcia. Happy to be here as always. And let me see if I can share my screen and get this going. Ta-ta. So, the housing affordability crisis. I mean, this is fascinating subject. It's on everybody's mind. I've been involved in housing in one way or another for close to 60 years. And the first thing, this has been an amazing period in terms of the sheer visibility and media attention and policy attention given to housing and the housing crisis. But what struck me first is a sense of deja vu. So I want to start out with this quote. I'm not going to read it to you. I'm assuming everybody on this webinar can read. But this was written by one of the most distinguished real estate economists of the time. And I love this. Here we had housing crisis. You could change the word, the years on this, and it would sound like it was written by somebody last week. So the point is, we have always had housing crises in the United States, at least since the end of World War II. Though we probably may have had one in the 20s or 30s, but I don't think we called it that. And we're now having another one. And I think there's certain things that are very much recurrent, but there are also some interesting and important differences. And I'm going to try to highlight those as I go along. So the first thing is we're talking about an affordability crisis primarily. This is what it's all about, affordability. And to me, when I think about affordability, I think it's mainly a renter issue. I mean, yes, affordability is a big problem for homeowners as well. But when a homeowner spends a lot of money for their home in terms of a mortgage, taxes, etc., in essence, that's a form of forced savings. Because what homeowners are doing are trying to translate current payments into equity, in essence. And so that means that both psychologically and economically, in the long run, even though it may not seem that way when you're paying your bills every month, home ownership is fundamentally different from rental when it comes to the entire affordability issue. So I'm going to concentrate mainly on rental affordability and secondarily on the question of people wanting to buy a home. I am not going to focus on homeowner affordability as such. And the key thing here is cost burden was not something we invented last week. Cost burden has been rising steadily in the United States in a very interesting pattern since the 1960s. In the 1960s, people were by and large, the vast majority of homeowners were of tenants, sorry, were not cost burden. Then there was a huge spike in the 70s, and then it leveled off for a couple of decades. And then there was another huge spike in the 2000s, which was parallel to the housing bubble. Since then, how housing cost burden for tenants has not changed dramatically at the national level. Now, that does not mean it hasn't changed significantly in certain areas, but as a national phenomenon, it has not changed significantly since roughly 2009, 2010. As you can see in these maps, there's some very significant differences. You look at the renter burden in the upper right-hand corner, you can see there are huge differences between different states in terms of the extent of renter cost burden. And again, it's not necessarily the cost of housing in that state. So Texas has a much lower cost of housing overall than California. It's the relationship between incomes and the cost of housing. Another thing, sales prices also rose very significantly during the pandemic, or really more actually immediately after the pandemic as such. After dropping during the Great Recession, they then rose gradually again. There was a spike. And interestingly, even though people tend to pay relatively little attention to this, overall sales prices in most parts of the country have been flat or even declining over the last couple of years. In other words, there was a huge spike and then it's definitely leveled off significantly. But overall, what it means, the ratio between household incomes and sales prices, even though it goes up, it goes down. It went up during the housing bubble, then it went down, then it started moving back up again. It is now probably at the highest that's been recorded since people started to record this sort of thing. So there's no question prices have gone up significantly. What that means, among other things, is that, again, there was a period, and in a way, we got I think, a little complacent because it was not necessarily typical of the long-term pattern. But after the housing bubble burst, house prices came down dramatically, even though incomes, after a brief dip during the Great Recession, were moving up. So there was a period, roughly from 2009 to 2019, 2020, when housing affordability by historical standards was actually pretty good in this country. So we got spoiled. We also came to believe that interest rates of 2.75% or 3% were somehow normal, even though they are a total anomaly in terms of the modern history of mortgage interest rates in this country. I'll come back to that. But the point is, a lot about the intensity in which we've greeted the current housing affordability crisis reflects the fact, and you can see it in this graph on the right as well, that we had about a decade of unusually favorable conditions for home ownership, which nobody fully appreciated how unusual it was. And then all of a sudden, bang, it ended. So just a couple of other things. Today, this gives a sense of house prices by metros. And this is the interesting thing. Remember, the median household income in the United States is somewhere around $80,000 or $90,000. So a typical two-wage earner couple can afford the median price in most parts of the country. But there is a cluster of metros where house prices are over, median house prices are over $500,000. And of course, what's notable is that 9 out of the 10 highest priced metros in the United States are in California. And many of the others are in key media regions like New York City, Boston, Washington, D.C. But another thing, because of because of not only the increase in prices and also the increasing disparity between renter income and homeowner income, a median renter cannot buy a house while paying, say, a third of their income for shelter in the great majority of metros. Now, somebody who's earning a renter earning 150% of the median rent has a shot in most metros. But the typical renter is effectively priced out of the homeownership market today. But another thing that's interesting, and again, this is maybe against conventional wisdom, that Realtor.com in particular, the realtors have been making much of the fact that fewer and fewer young people are homeowners or can buy a first home. But the data doesn't necessarily support that. The homeownership rate by age group actually bottomed out some in the mid 2010s for almost everybody in the wake of the Great Recession and the foreclosure crisis, then started to move up again. And the homeownership rate for young people is low, certainly lower than it was at the peak of the bubble, much lower. But that's true of everybody. So again, there hasn't been that much of a shift in homeownership as some of the media stuff would suggest. But it is getting harder and harder for renters to make the jump into homeownership in this country. Now, looking at some price shifts, and I'm going to go through these very quickly because they're just sort of more background than anything else. There was a big difference. A lot of Sunbelt cities saw an amazing price spike, like San Diego, Miami, Austin, during the period immediately after the pandemic. Most Rust Belt cities did not. But overall, median rents increased dramatically compared to the previous 5-year period from 2020 to 2025 in most cities. Not everyone. San Francisco and LA, in a way, were kind of outliers. But if you look at Miami, Miami went completely berserk in the past 5 years in terms of prices. Irvine, New York did. But a lot of lower price cities also saw significant increases, including Fort Wayne. I don't know why Fort Wayne is on here, but must have showed up somewheres. Tulsa, Cleveland, not so much. Baton Rouge, Wichita. So there are a lot of cities saw significant increases in rents during the last 5 years. And the same is true of house prices. So if you look at high price cities, most of them actually saw a greater rate of increase in the last 5 years than in the period from 2000 to 2020. And as you can see, currently, there are some incredibly expensive cities out there. But again, what's interesting, all of these are on the West Coast. And most of them are in California. And that's where the biggest price spikes have been taking place. At the same time, there have been increases in low price cities like Oklahoma City or Baltimore or St. Louis. But for the most part, the prices in these cities are still very affordable to, say, if you a middle income family, somebody earning at the median national income. Now, admittedly, these are cities where people tend to be not as affluent as the national average. But if you have a halfway decent income, you can afford to buy a house in America's lower price cities. And there's some obviously great neighborhoods and great houses in these cities. So some more information. Another big factor was vacancy rates plummeted during, again, this started long before the pandemic or the current housing crisis conference. It basically, vacancy rates peaked at the point where the housing bubble burst, which is logical enough. Then they came down, they bottomed out during the year or two after the pandemic. And again, the pandemic was clearly a critical inflection point in housing in all kinds of ways. Now, since then, again, they've been coming back up, but they're still relatively low from a historic standpoint. Now, I'm going to spend a little time on this because this looks at what actually happened during the year or two after the pandemic. Essentially, what we ended up with was almost like a perfect storm of housing factors. The first thing was, and I'm going to get to this because this is an important point, even though it's not quite as important as some people seem to think it is. We were not, during the decade following the foreclosure crisis, we significantly underproduced housing. We used up whatever surplus we'd created and then some relative to households being formed. So that the accumulated effect of that was starting to tell. Household formation there was a lot of pent up household formation during the first few years after the foreclosure crisis. More families, by the end of the decade, more families were forming households, but we were still underproducing. That additional supply dropped during the pandemic. A lot of construction sites closed. Also, a lot of people, and this is shown in the inventory style, and this is really intriguing, that an awful lot of homeowners who might have put their houses on the market decided not to during the pandemic. They, among other things, didn't want strangers traipsing through their houses, bringing COVID with them. But what you can see here is the size. This is the inventory of existing houses on the market. And as you can see, it's a very seasonal thing. It goes up in the summers, down in the winters, historically. And in a way, it was tailing off a little bit during the decade before the pandemic. Then it just plummeted from a typical average of about 1.25 million houses being available at any time to only 400,000. So all of a sudden, there's this incredible constriction in the supply of houses to buy on the market. At the same time, a lot of people, especially bearing in mind that there were these incredibly low interest rates, and starting to see, hey, why am I renting? Or why am I working from home in a one-bedroom apartment? Went onto the market and discovered an incredibly small supply. So that created a price spike for home buying and also pushed a lot of potential home buyers either back into the rental market, or if they're going into the first time, into the rental market rather than the homeowner market. So you had a sort of a side effect. The constriction in homeownership opportunities actually sort of reverberated and increased costs in the rental market. So all of these things came together during the pandemic. Now, again, in many cases, as I've suggested, they have been relaxing ever since. But the one thing that really, I think, changed people's perspectives on this was the amazingly sudden increase in mortgage interest rates that happened in 21, 22. Because as I mentioned, people had gotten accustomed. People had had a decade or more of historically low interest rates, which meant that not only had people gotten used to it, but a huge percentage of the housing stock with mortgages now had, either because people had bought or because people had refinanced, now had extraordinarily low interest rates. So the typical homeowner, not only, you had the pandemic effect, but you had a lock-in effect because they had such low interest rates. So if you have a house and you're paying 3% interest, and you may want a bigger house or a different house or so forth, but you'll think twice because of the interest rate effects of moving and buying a new house. The other thing, it was incredibly sudden. It happened really fast, as the graph showed. So, and I think we're still impacted by that. Now, again, as you can see by this graph, which starts back in 1970, historically, basically what we've gone back to is normal. We're even a little below the historical average, but it doesn't feel like that. It feels like we've got an extraordinary high interest rate climate going on, which is not the case, but it does feel that way. So all of these things come together. But now I'd like to, so actually, this is a good point to shift gears a little bit for a moment. Let me take a quick look at the chat and see if there are any issues I really should be focusing on.
Alan, there was a Q&A question that was asking whether you have any knowledge of in California if the amount of fires and other stuff, natural disaster, to what extent does natural disaster contribute to, losing units and rising costs?
Yeah. Well, natural disasters, I guess, fortunately, have not significantly affected the number of housing units. I mean, there are a couple of cases. There was one small town up in the northeast part of the state, Paradise, I think it was called, which was pretty much clobbered. And of course, we know about LA. But so there have been some effects, but in the larger picture, that has not been a huge number. One thing that the increase in natural disasters has done, though, is, and especially in California and Florida, is, as you know, the classic equation for how much you should pay is PITI, principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. And insurance costs are going up generally, but they are going up a lot faster in areas that are potentially impacted by natural disasters. So I think that's probably a greater factor than the literal loss of units associated with the fires. Though, again, if you live in Altadena, then obviously that's the big issue. And that was just, that something like that could happen is utterly frightening. And that could, of course, happen in an awful lot of other places over the coming decades. So now I'd like to shift to really digging into the whole question of cost burden, because again, this is an affordability housing crisis. So how have all of the factors I've been talking about affected affordability? This, I think, is a really important graph. This shows rental cost burden by income. The green bars reflect the percentage of people in each income range who are paying 50% or more of their income for shelter. And what it basically shows is a huge and, I guess, somewhat predictable gap. If you are poor or near poor, the odds are heavy, even overwhelming, that you're going to pay 50% or more of your income for shelter, unless you're fortunate enough to get into deeply affordable housing or get a housing choice voucher. And as you all probably know, roughly four-fifths of people who qualify for housing vouchers do not have one. So basically, if you are, and you can see up to about $30,000 household income, you are likely or overwhelmingly likely to be severely cost burdened. If you make more than $50,000 a year, and that we're talking about 60% of median on up, the odds are overwhelming that you will not be severely cost burdened, but you may be cost burdened in the sense of paying 30, 35, 40% of your income for rent. But again, and I'll get into this further, that does not mean the same thing at all income levels. So this is really critical because I want to stress the problem of cost burden is overwhelmingly a problem for very low and extremely low income households in the United States. It is not a central problem for most middle class or certainly affluent households in the United States. Not that it is not a problem at all, but it is not a significant problem. Again, outside certain, and I would characterize them as isolated metropolitan areas. So if this again, put some numbers on it. 83% of all of the families in the United States, or households rather, that are severely cost burdened have incomes under $35,000 a year. They represent less than 20% of all American households, but 83% of the ones that are severely cost burdened. I think it's really important to remember this. And I maybe sound like I'm overstressing it or something, but I think it's critical because when you read about how cost burden is a middle class problem, and again, I don't want to minimize the problem of individual families who find themselves in a financial bind. It is overwhelmingly a problem for very low income families.
And
Now,
I would add, Alan, that one of the reasons you emphasize it so much is that it means that any solutions we come up with have to address that group of people,
yeah,
or else we're not really
exactly.
having a
Or
solution.
let me put it differently. If we do anything that we do that does not address that population is not a solution to the affordability problem in this country. Now,
Mhm.
one thing is, and this shows it, that depending on the city you're looking at, there are huge variations. So, for example, if you look at this in San Francisco, about a quarter, a little more than a quarter of all families earning $50,000 to $75,000 are severely cost burdened. But in Dallas or Detroit, it's an insignificant percentage. So this again, are huge differences between cities and metros. And a lot of that has to do, number one, obviously, with the fact that you housing is vastly more expensive in San Francisco than in Detroit, or for that matter, in Dallas. But also that people want desperately, for whatever reason, to live in San Francisco. And so there's huge competition for the available housing. And so, as you can see, the, there's tremendous disparities between the cost burden level in different cities. One thing I should add, I'm not going to talk about this in detail, but homelessness, as I think we all know, it is persistent. It is does it's not going away. And now homelessness is about many things. It is about addiction. It is about mental illness. It is about a lot of things, but it is also and very heavily about housing costs. So if you look at the country, almost half of all of the homeless people in the United States are counted in California and New York, and another almost a quarter in other high cost states. So it's important to remember homelessness is about many things, but housing cost significantly impacts homelessness. Okay, so to sum up, basically, you could say three groups are represented most heavily among those impacted by the affordability housing crisis. First and foremost, low income renters. Secondly, low and middle income would be home buyers in medium and high cost areas. Again, there are many parts of the country where home buying is still feasible, but there are many areas where it is not. And then finally, people who live in high cost areas, particularly, again, California. California is the most impacted state by with respect to housing costs. So now let's look at why. To sum up, and again, I want to sum up, and this is because, and I'm going to talk about these factors. So you have underproduction of new housing. And one of the key reasons, and this has become the focus of the so-called YIMBY movement, is the proposition that the underproduction is the result of exclusionary land use and environmental regulations, especially zoning. That's true, but it's not the only thing. In addition, we have high development costs. Development costs, and I'll get into this, have skyrocketed in the last 10, 15 years. Secondly, and this is something people aren't talking about too much. I'm hoping that, I've been talking to Marcia about doing a webinar on this, and with my colleague Todd Swanstrom in the future, is we're losing hundreds of thousands of viable older housing units every year. Neglect, demolition, fires, etc. Third, and I emphasize this, is we have a fundamental gap between what low-income people are paid in the US economy and what it costs to provide minimally decent rental housing. Then a few other things: expensive financing, the financialization of housing, which has pushed prices up, and then, of course, the persistence of post-pandemic and what are known as price ratchet effects, which is that once prices go up, they can go up very fast, but they tend to go down only very slowly, if at all. So all of these factors are affecting the housing costs. So let's talk about them. First thing, there's no serious question. There has been an underproduction of housing. Now, what's interesting is that there's been a fair amount of catch up by this, and by this is not the only way to analyze this issue, but I find it useful by just comparing the number of units added to the number of households created over the same period. And if you look at the period from 2000 to the present, you can see there was a huge shortfall from 2010 to 2019. We've caught up somewhat since then, though that actually has less to do with building more housing as fewer household formations. But we're still, if you average it out for the last 25 years, we've fallen short by 2.6 million in terms of the number of housing units that should have been built to keep pace with demand. And as I say, there are lots of other estimates. Actually, I think some estimates go as high as 7 million. But the point is, there's been a shortfall. The second thing is zoning exclusion is real and powerful. I picked this one example, a township in Connecticut, where basically the smallest residential unit you can build, residential lot you can build on without a special permit is 2 acres. Now, which is ludicrous. So exclusionary zoning is still a huge factor. And it's fascinating that we've seen a wave of state law changes in the last 5 years to restrict municipal powers to exclude, to use zoning for exclusionary purposes. Because hopefully, local zoning in the United States is strictly regulated by state law. State law defines what municipalities can and cannot do. And what has been amazing is, as I said, in the last 5 years, and this is the first time this has happened since states passed the initial zoning enabling ordinances back in the 1920s. For the first time, states have actually reined in municipal zoning powers by changing state laws. And it's been quite impressive, but with the exception of one thing that I'll get to, the results so far have been minimal. And there's a lesson in that. Okay, going on. But during that same period, development costs, this is an indication. This is, based on a very in-depth study that was recently done in Portland, Maine, that looked at every housing project built since 2011. By land price went up by more than double. Construction cost more than doubled. And interest rates for construction financing went up by almost 50%. And this is comparing the first part of the last decade to the first part of our current decade. This is an extraordinary shift in an extraordinarily short period. And now there are a lot of reasons why construction costs have gone up so fast, which I'm not going to get into. But the point is, this has made it increasingly difficult in many parts of the country, most parts of the country, for people to build new housing that will fit in the sweet spot in terms of where the people are, even the people in the middle class who need new housing. Clearly, if you're going to pay $300 per square foot for construction, your end product is going to be a lot more expensive than you're paying $150 a square foot. Ditto land. So all of this has had a huge effect on construction costs. And the result is today, we're looking at, in high cost areas like San Francisco or New York, new multifamily construction is costing over $500 a square foot in construction hard costs alone. So just a simple pro forma, mini pro forma, you might say. If you want to build 100 units of 1,000 square feet each in an apartment building in San Francisco today, and 1,000 square feet, as I'm sure you all know, is not a huge unit. It's a respectable unit. It's a big 1-bedroom. It's a medium-sized 2-bedroom. It's a very tight 3-bedroom. In order to deliver those units, the finished cost per unit is going to be over $1 million. Now, to me, that is flat out insane. But that is the reality. That is what it actually costs. I remember a few years ago talking to a woman who ran a habitat chapter in the San Francisco Bay Area. And even then, she was saying their new units, when you took the all in costs, cost the equivalent of $800,000 a unit for habitat product. These were not even detached houses, they were condos. So, this is a huge issue because it, again, if you're going to sell a unit for $1 million, especially if it's a small unit in an apartment building, the income people need to buy that unit is vastly higher than where the incomes are of the people who need housing or can't afford housing. And this creates a problem which I think a lot of the supply people don't appreciate. You making housing production work is a mesh of supply and demand. It doesn't matter how easy it is to increase supply if the end product is too expensive for where the demand is. And that's essentially what's happening in places like California or New York. Now, it's not happening in Texas, and I'll get there, which is quite interesting. Okay. So what we're seeing, in fact, is that there's in 25 years ago, house prices weren't that different on a regional basis in this country. A new house that was produced in Connecticut cost about the same as a new house that was produced in Iowa or Oregon or Arizona or wherever. Today, a new house that's produced in the Northeast is likely to cost 2.5 to 3 times as much as a new house being produced in the South. And a lot of this has to do, again, with demand, but also differential land costs, probably regulation to a significant extent, but a lot of different factors going into it. Another thing that's important, and I mentioned in my list of impacts, the concept of the structural gap, and I want to come back to this. So I did an analysis, this is about a year or so ago. What would a responsible landlord have to charge in rent if they bought a very low priced house in Detroit, put a small amount of money in it to fix it up, and they wanted to get a 10% annual return on their total investment? Well, the short answer is they would have to rent that house for, actually, this is a 5% return on their investment, actually. They would have to rent it for $1,200 a month. Now, the median income of renters in Detroit is $30,000 too. What that means is that this is, again, we're talking about somebody coming into the rental market, buying a house about as at the lowest price that you can find a house that does not need major rehab, putting in a small amount of money and then renting it, but paying your taxes, carrying insurance, maintaining it at an adequate level, and so forth. Well, 64% of the tenants in Detroit would not be able to afford that house, paying 30% of their income. And what this means, again, it's housing, the basic cost of what it takes to provide housing is too much for low wage or no wage earners in the United States. Because if we can look at what does the median worker make in these jobs, look at this. This to me is absolutely amazing. It's shameful, but it's reality. The median worker, and again, that means half earn less, half earn more. The median childcare worker in this country makes less than $35,000. The median home health aide makes less than $35,000. The median waiter Well, they get some tips maybe. The medium cashier at Walmart barely makes $30,000. The thing is, you can work full time at one of these jobs, but if you are the sole income in your household, you cannot afford the most inexpensive house that's provided as well with a responsible landlord and at least some equity stake that they've got to get a return on. So the, re- the result is this is why, for all practical purposes, anybody earning less than $30,000 or $25,000 in this country, unless they have a housing choice voucher, is cost burdened or severely cost burdened because we have a structural gap between what people make and what housing costs. And that is intrinsic to our economy. And the only way we can fill that gap is with public subsidy because we cannot produce housing that's inexpensive enough for people in all of these jobs or similar jobs in this country to afford without public subsidy. It's as simple as that. We can't even get close. Now, one thing, and I'd like to switch gears for a minute, because one of the interesting byproducts of the cost spike and the pandemic, and which is specifically applicable to a lot of middle neighborhoods, is that prices have gone up in a lot of middle neighborhoods. This looks at Baltimore, and it was a very interesting thing. For years, Baltimore tracks vacant properties better and closer to real time than I think any other city in the country. And for over a decade since they started tracking, vacant properties were pretty much, there were around between 15 and 16,000 vacant properties in Baltimore. Starting just around the time, just before, but just around the time of the pandemic, they started to go down. And in the last 5 years, they've dropped by 25%. But meanwhile, prices in Baltimore have gone up as a result, very much as a result of the pandemic. Though it was starting beforehand, as you can see, the slope got steeper during the pandemic. It's leveled off a little, but it's continuing to go up. And this is predominantly in Baltimore's middle neighborhoods, because what had happened was a very interesting phenomenon. Prior to roughly the last 5, 6 years, there you had what is known as a market gap. Essentially, if a property became vacant in a typical middle neighborhood, it sat vacant unless something happened with the public sector or a nonprofit using public money to do something about it, because the cost to acquire it and rehab it on the private market exceeded what a developer would be able to get for it once they'd finished rehabbing it. But the gap was usually not very big, but it was there. It was big enough to discourage the market. Well, during the pandemic, the gap disappeared. And all of a sudden, what you started to get is see small, essentially mom and pop developers rehabbing houses in middle neighborhoods. And this is in a neighborhood called Edmondson Village, which is kind of my poster child. It's the classic Baltimore, predominantly Black middle neighborhood. Lots of little row houses. Well, 10 years ago, you couldn't give away a vacant house in Edmondson Village. The only vacant houses that were rehabbed was the ones that the city took and recycled through its receivership program. Today, vacant houses are selling for $50,000 to $75,000 in Edmondson Village. The developer buys one, puts another 125,000, 150,000 into it. As you can see, does a pretty good looking rehab job, often opens up the ground floor to make more space, takes down a wall too. I hope they put in some kind of structural support, and then sells it, in this case, for $279,900. So this has changed the market in middle neighborhoods. And before I get into the larger solutions and challenges conversation, just a few quick lessons for people, especially people who might be listening, who are involved in varying ways in trying to revitalize or plan for or think about middle neighborhoods in their communities. First, really understand your market. If what's happening in your neighborhood is similar to what's happening in Edmondson Village, that means you've got private investment coming in that can be leveraged. So really understand what's happening in your market. And if you do have private investment, because I've talked to people who are working in middle neighborhoods in a number of other cities, and they say they're seeing similar patterns to what's happening in Baltimore that I just talked about. Then, to the extent that you have public resources, figure out how to use them to complement the private investment, not to substitute for it, because there's never enough public money to go around. So, for example, if people are rehabbing houses, but mainly renting them out, you might be able to incentivize them with a relatively small amount of money to sell them to a home buyer instead. You might be able to put in some money so that they would reduce the price so it's affordable to a lower income family. And also focus on public improvements so that the neighborhood as a whole moves along with the improved housing. And don't ignore two other key issues, which tend to sometimes fall by the wayside in the focus on vacant properties and redevelopment, which is problem landlords and problem rental properties and struggling, mostly older, lower income homeowners who are living in substandard or unhealthy housing. So that's just very quickly a just shout out to the middle neighborhoods people here. Okay, now what can be done about this? I want to keep saying this, because the media narrative is that it's all about housing supply and nothing else. And if we just get rid of those pesky zoning laws and environmental regulations and unleash the private sector, we'll solve the problem. This is not so. And I am not against changing zoning laws. I think we should. And we overdo it on environmental regulations. And as somebody who just had to go out and hire a herpetologist to check for the presence of turtles on the site of a project I'm working on, I'm very sensitive to that. I don't think he's going to find any turtles, but we have to pay $15,000 to have him come out and look for turtles. But that's a digression. But so here is this is three basic things. We do need to build more housing. What we do not need to do particularly is build more million plus high rise housing units in San Francisco or Manhattan, because that is a waste of money to build stuff that only the rich can afford. Sure, there'll be a certain amount of filtering, but not enough to make a difference. So we need to build the right kind of housing, and we need to build it in places where it makes sense. Number two, it is not just about relaxing regulations. It is about recognizing market realities, cost constraints, financing availability, demand, and so forth. Regulation is only one part of a multi-factor problem. And then finally, no market solution, no solution that simply tries to unleash the power of the market. And I want to make it clear, I am a passionate believer in the power of and the importance of the market. But no market-based solution can solve the fundamental cost rent gap problem, which is the disparity between what it costs to produce and maintain housing on the one hand, and what our economy pays low-wage workers on the other. That is not amenable to a market solution, no matter what anybody tries to claim. And that's true, equally true of homelessness, because one of the most fundamental things about homeless people, they have lots of different characteristics, problems, issues, backgrounds, histories, and so forth. But they all share one characteristic. They have very little money, which means they are not going to be able to benefit from a market solution. And every significant example where a city has been able to make significant inroads in homelessness, a critical part of it has been by allocating a significant share of the available vouchers to homeless people so that they would be able to live someplace which they simply could not afford with their own means. So first, what kind of housing do we need? We want. One of the interesting things of all of the regulatory changes that have happened, the one that has had by far the most impact in California, Washington State, and elsewhere has been where states have said municipalities must allow accessory dwelling units. In California today, as a result of that law, 1 out of every 5 new units being created in the state of California is an accessory dwelling unit, which means either a new unit inside an existing house, attached to an existing house, or on the same lot as an existing house. So again, they're inexpensive compared to building high-rise towers. They're tremendously inexpensive. They are mostly put out for rent. I did a recent study of accessory dwelling units on the West Coast. The great majority fall within the fair market rents for potential voucher holders. So they are the closest thing to a solution that can be implemented and can get relatively fast results almost anywhere, at least in areas of high demand that exists. As I said, it's the only thing of the dozens of things California has done to try to change zoning laws and encourage new housing. So far, it's the only one that has borne significant results. Secondly, here are small houses being built in San Antonio by a national developer. It's a subdivision of small houses selling for $129,900. Now, building costs in Texas are somewhat lower, or at least they were until relatively recently, than in most other parts of the country, but not that much lower. You could replicate that house for under $200,000 in, let's say, Pennsylvania or Illinois. When you bear in mind that over 3/4 of all the additional households added in the last 15 years in this country were 1 or 2 person households, it makes sense. This is a great little unit. If I didn't have a house already, and if I wanted to move to San Antonio, I'd try to buy one. Fortunately, neither of those apply. But again, this is a case of building a product that is relevant to the people who need housing, not a product that looks good. Another one thing that's really interesting, and I know some people might find this inappropriate because it's about sprawl. You can, in most metropolitan areas in the United States, you can build more inexpensive housing in the suburbs than you can in the central city. You can't solve your housing problems in the central city because building in a place like San Francisco or Manhattan or Austin involves going up, it gets expensive, it becomes a niche market, you're not meeting the needs, so forth. These are good sized 3 bedroom and 4 bedroom houses being built in a suburb of Dallas called Princeton, Texas. I wonder where they got that name from. And they're selling for under $300,000, which means that a working class 2 income couple can typically afford to buy one of these houses. And there you are. Now, this is an aerial view of this development. It's tight. It's about 7 or 8 units to the acre. Again, in the sense that this is moving out from the center, it is sprawl. But this is, as you can see, a very compact, very efficient, from a land standpoint, way of delivering single family houses. And again, the suburbs are where the land is. The suburbs are where you can build stick inexpensively. So again, this may seem counter to a lot of what one is hearing about planning and so forth, but cities where costs have been moderated, and Austin is a good example, Minneapolis is another. In both of those cities and similar places, you're seeing most of the development in the metro is actually happening in the suburbs, and it's creating opportunity for people to move out, freeing up housing in the cities for people who want to live in the cities, and keeping prices relatively moderate. One of the main reasons why San Francisco and New York are so expensive is not because of the city itself, but because so little development is taking place in their suburbs. So people have no choice but to sort of cram into the city and push prices up. Then beyond that, the reality is even the LIHTC program, which is for all practical purposes the only program in the United States that explicitly tries to address lower income housing needs, is essentially going after the sort of the moderate income, 50, 60% of AMI. People who have less than that, so somebody earning, say, 30,000, living in a LIHTC development, either has a voucher or is paying 40 or 50% of their income for shelter. It is not reaching the people with severe cost burden earning $25,000, $30,000, $20,000. So one idea that has been widely discussed, but not obviously implemented, is to develop a universal voucher program, essentially analogous to SNAP or Medicaid, to take advantage of the fact that it is still vastly more cost effective to house people in existing housing, older housing, even if it needs repairs or upgrading, than to build new housing and subsidize new housing, especially if you're talking about California, where you'd have to subsidize it down from $1 million or close to that per unit. So finally, we have to ask the question, do we as a society want to solve the housing crisis? And there's a couple of reasons why you have to doubt that. The first one is that we'd have to spend a lot of money just to do that. Now, in terms of the total federal budget, it would not be a lot of money. The total federal budget is something like $5 trillion, I think. We could meet of the needs of our low income very low income population and eliminate the housing affordability crisis for between 100 and 200 billion a year. It's doable, but if you look at the budget and if you look at people's reluctance to increase taxes, it's highly doubtful whether we want to do it enough to make that move. Secondly, everybody still wants to move to high cost, high demand areas, pushing up demand. If we could only convince people who want to live in California that they really want to live in Kansas, we could solve a significant part of this crisis instantly. But that's a tough sell, I realize. Then finally, something which you've got to realize, high housing costs benefit more people than they harm in our society. 65% of Americans own their own home. I venture a guess that 90% of them are extremely concerned about the value of their equity and about their ability to take advantage of that equity, either for their retirement, to pass on to their kids, or for whatever purpose. For all of those people, keeping house prices high is not only important, it's, as the Ford people used to say, job one. And so when we have to realize the number of people looking for houses in the market at any given point, especially the number of people in high cost areas who are frozen out of the market because of high costs, is a very small number compared to the number of people who already own their homes and who want to keep prices up. So just a thought to bear when we look at these issues, we have to see it in sort of bigger terms and ask the question, do we really want to solve the housing crisis, or do we just want to act like we want to solve the housing crisis? So think about that when you look at what's going on in your communities and what would be involved in each of your communities to actually eliminate severe cost burden and ensure that every family actually had a decent place to live that at a price that they could afford. And then figure out what you can do about it. So thank you, and let's turn to some
Jump
questions.
to the questions. It occurs to me, I think I might also add to that list, do, something about our seeming addiction to paying very low wages. You know,
Yeah,
um,
I
yeah,
think that's something that we, and this is the complicated, why it is and how it works is complicated, but we have essentially built a society where the economic model of large sectors of our society, including elder care, retail trade, and child care, to a certain extent construction, but less so, and so forth, is dependent on low wages, which I would characterize as exploitation of the low wage workforce.
yeah,
And I
it's
think,
the business model.
it's our model, and it would be exceedingly painful to change it. I mean, if we actually paid elder care workers 60,000 a year instead of 30,000, what would that think about how that would impact our insurance, private insurance, Medicare, people's savings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
It's
It's
a big, big
it's a
problem.
huge issue.
So I wanted to jump in on questions because we don't have a lot of time. I like the question that Susan McCulloch from Danville asked. Could you elaborate a little on the public resources? This was from your middle neighborhoods suggestion slide. on public resources, like what has been done? Is there a grant range? I think this is about incentivizing developers. What public improvements might you suggest? Things like greenscape and infrastructure?
Yeah. Okay. First thing is the dollar amounts. I don't know where I. Oh, there we go. The dollar amounts are going to vary. You have to really look at the individual cases. So, for example, one thing we've seen in Baltimore and in a couple of other cities is that the developers who are rehabbing these houses, for whatever reasons, they're more likely either to hold them and rent them out or to sell them to investors than they are to sell them to home buyers. Now, obviously, there's some kind of a break point in their business model, though, which if you gave them X dollars, it would make it more attractive for them to sell to a home buyer than to sell to an investor. But X is going to vary locally. So you've got to really get to know the developers who are rehabbing houses in your city, find out how they see their business model, and then try to figure out what public investment would take to get them to either commit to putting it into the home buyer market or alternatively commit to keeping it affordable so that you're not losing, affordable housing stock. So that's
Mhm.
very local, very localized. Quality of life is a variety of things. And again, you look at the particular area. It could be shade trees, for example, on a street. It could be repairing curbs and sidewalks or repaving a street. It could be creating a pocket park or perhaps upgrading an existing park and spending some money to animate it with activity so people start to see it as being a safe and a good place to go to. So I think there are a lot of different things. You really have to look neighborhood by neighborhood at what are the key things this neighborhood is missing. And I would
Mhm.
say in all cases, one of the reasons it is so important is that, when a market starts to move up and create these kinds of positive changes that we're seeing in some middle neighborhoods, there's no guarantee that it's going to stay that way. Markets can go down. In fact, I was talking to somebody yesterday in Baltimore who says he thinks that the Baltimore market is basically peaked. The middle neighborhood market is basically peaked.
Mm.
Maybe, maybe not. But the point is,
Okay.
what you're trying to do is take advantage of the rising market to create
Mhm.
for renewed stability in that neighborhood. And that's why making the neighborhood as nice as a neighborhood is critically important because that's something that might enhance stability even when the market starts to level off or even decline.
When it turns around, yeah. I've seen not NeighborWorks organization. I'm thinking of a time in Chattanooga when this is quite a few years ago, but when they were identifying the small flippers. So like mom and pop teams who would they could maybe process 2 or 3 buildings a year, but they like to work in the same neighborhood. But they would, subsidize their interest rates on their financing or something like that to get them to sort of accelerate their work and to have them do some things that would make it easy to flip to homeownership. So it's sort of like, what can you give the developer to put some gas on that fire and have it turn out to be a project you like? Elizabeth Salaya asks a great question. What, if any, policy shifts do you think could effectively incentivize repair, restoration, and adaptive reuse as more significant tools to address housing supply? Which you're
Well,
about to publish a book about, right?
yeah, well, we have a book that's coming out at the end of August. It's called "The Other Housing Crisis," and the
Mm.
subtitle is ending the deterioration and loss of affordable homes. So it
Ooh.
focuses very much on the repair issue. But I think one thing, and I think it's kind of unfortunate that some of the, we're currently seeing a rollback of a lot of sort of environmental incentives because those could really facilitate things like adaptive reuse and restoration if we
Hmm.
actually looked at the carbon impacts of the different ways of creating housing. But I think we, you know, we really have to look at a lot of different issues there. One is, the environmental issue. Second is financing. What kind of finance? It's a lot easier, actually. If I wanted to build yet another expensive high-rise building in San Francisco, I probably wouldn't have any trouble getting financing. If I wanted to do some kind of a complicated restoration project involving multiple units and multiple properties and so forth, it might be, like pulling teeth. So creating financing strategies that really work for these. One thing I've been looking at, I think it's a big issue, which we don't even talk about, is all over this. We have substandard, small scale rental housing, 1s to 4s, small multifamilies. This most low income families live in private rental housing. Most of it is not apartment buildings, it's 1 to 4 family units. And a lot of it is in very bad shape. And a lot of it is owned by mom and pop landlords who are not wealthy people themselves. And one of the problems they have, if you ask them to, why don't you fix the roof so it doesn't leak or replace the heater or what have you, is how am I going to finance it? Where am I going to get the money from? Who's going to lend to me? So forth. That's a huge issue that we need. We need to address the financing issue at all kinds of different levels. I the other now in the final analysis, we can't create enough. We need to build a lot of new housing, at least for the next few decades, until at some point population may stop to grow, but it's not yet. But the more housing we restore, we repair, we create through adaptive reuse, the less new housing we need to build. So it's not an either or, but we should maximize it. But again, financing, environmental restrict. We need more, certainly flexible land use requirements, and we also should be looking more at something. This is a third rail for a lot of people. Building codes and making sure that they don't impede, well-intentioned requirements that nonetheless make the difference between whether it's feasible to, say, rehab the upper floors of a commercial building on a commercial strip for housing rather than let them sit vacant or be used for storage. Things like that. So there are a lot of different pieces to that one.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And it's, I can assure you that there's going to be a bit of a theme coming over the next year of webinars, where we're going to make a point of trying to illuminate those kinds of solutions. I think Alan actually and Alice Mann and I had started and need to get back to trying to write a paper on how a municipality might, in an organized fashion, actually look at what their underutilized housing stock situation is and to think about how they would design a plank of their, supply of affordable housing strategy um, to stem the loss of units by just not paying attention to them. I think I'm going to do one more question and then we're going to have to wrap up.
Okay. This is a
Oh, go
quick one.
ahead.
I see one here from Eric.
Yeah, that's where I was going to go. Go ahead.
Has the proliferation of single person renter households played a meaningful role in keeping renter incomes low? The short answer is two things have, or three things. First, the proliferation of single person renters. Second, the fact that by and large, in many parts of this country, if you have two incomes, a two-income family, which is typically a married couple, you can afford to buy a house. Not always. I realize there are markets where it doesn't work and there are incomes that are maybe too low. But if you have two incomes at or around the median national income, say anywhere between 60 and 100,000 each, you can afford to buy a house. So what's happened is that two-income families, married couple families, have effectively left the rental market, and which means that what you've got is disproportionately single people and overwhelmingly single income people, moms with kids. So the single mom with kids is probably the single most likely demographic group to be renting rather than
Mhm.
owning.
Um, yeah, very interesting. Okay, you want to stop sharing your screen so that Anne can share a slide. And you just want to put up our next webinar slide. And also, Alan, do you have a few more minutes?
Sure.
One of the thing, what I think I'm going to do is just for the recording's sake is keep Alan on to answer other questions I see in the chat so that we can at least record his responses. And
Sure.
that way, if you're listening to the recording later, you can hear what he has to say about those. But if you have to leave, of course, we understand. So I just wanted to mention that our upcoming webinar, which we haven't quite settled on a date yet, but it's going to be next month, is going to be with Chris Hoff at NCST, who does lots and lots of mapping of middle neighborhoods. And he's going to do a session for us with some of the local clients he's done this for, where he does mapping over time of how the middle neighborhoods in their communities have changed, the location of them. I just threw up a map, a three map series here. I had him do of Albuquerque. That was a great discussion point with a group of development focused folks there so that you can really see how your middle neighborhoods are shifting, disappearing, starting to be broken up, and then discuss what the implications of that are for policy. So keep an eye out for your email for that. And I also want to just say that everyone who's here is going to become a member of our community of practice. And that means that you will get to be on our mailing list and hear about every webinar that we're about to pull off for you. And if you have any suggestions, you can make them in the evaluation that you'll get after you check out of this webinar, because we ask for your ideas on future topics that you'd like to see webinars about. So before a bunch of people leave us, thank you so much, Alan. I really, really appreciate it. And this has been a fantastic series. I wish we could, bottle this for every incoming new community development professional, because it's a great amount of information I wish I'd had myself when I was starting out. So thanks to everyone who has to leave, and we're going to stick around with Alan, and I'm going to post some more of the questions in the chat to him. Okay,
Okay.
so let's see what we have.
Yeah. Why don't I just start? I've got the
Yeah,
chat
you
open
go.
here. So I'll start with, shouldn't these compact neighborhoods be townhouses?
Hmm.
And frankly, from a land use planning and environmental standpoint, it makes total sense. There still seems to be, for whatever reason, on the part of home buyers, a distinct preference for detached houses, even if you're talking about a yard that's basically wide enough on the sides just to squeeze your body by between the property line and the house. Even so, it seems to be a preference. One interesting thing about the Dallas Metro is that a very large part of the home buying population, the people who are buying those houses in the 250 to 300,000 range, are working class. They're working class families, again, two earner families, and a very large percentage of them are Latino first and second generation Americans who are, again, have stable employment, are to varying degrees upwardly mobile. And for them, buying a house in the suburbs, a real house, is a really critical part of building their American identity. And in a way, I think that's great. Okay. What are the solutions to maintain existing housing owned by older owners or lower income inherited owners? Can we? I think I'd like to pass on that. That's an entire set
That's
webinar.
another webinar.
That's a webinar in itself.
We
Yeah.
have done a webinar on that, but yeah, that I just do want to say that is a fantastic question. It's absolutely critical, I think, to maintaining the fabric of a middle neighborhood, because they're an increasingly large part of our neighborhoods, and their housing stock is the stock that's going to go on the market when they leave, that has not been updated since 19 whatever. And that's one of the weak points in our system of finding the next generation of
Yeah.
home buyers.
Yeah.
So we'll do another webinar on that.
And that's particular. Yeah, exactly. In older neighborhoods and older, smaller cities, I'm doing some work in Binghamton, New York currently. And over 40% of all the homeowners in Binghamton are over 65 in the entire city. And, this is a critical issue because, again, people are aging. And this is going to become more and more important because our population as a whole is aging. Next,
Yeah.
does building out increase transportation costs? Yes. And one of the things that's unfortunate is that there are things that could be done in terms of creating transit routes and designing housing so it relates to transit in an efficient way and things like that, which unfortunately are not being done. So the answer is clearly it's going to increase transportation costs relative to just building high rise in already developed areas with transit like downtowns, but a lot of those costs could be mitigated if you had the right kind of planning going on. I should mention, by the way, in that context, I'm inclined to believe that within the next 5 to 10 years, self-driving vehicles and hopefully self-driving electric vehicles will start becoming much more common and much more generally accepted than they are now. And one of the things about that is going to make, from the standpoint of the friction associated with suburban commuting, it's going to make it much easier for people to live in the suburbs. And assuming those cars rather, are electric rather than gas powered, the environmental costs should not be too great.
Yeah. You still
Okay.
have something on your list there? I've got ones in the Q&A thing
Yeah.
too.
Okay, let's see what we've got here. Okay, I'll just mention briefly here, is there additional insight that takes race into account? And I think it's
Mhm.
important. I did not mention it explicitly, but when we look at the whether it's the wage cost gap, whether it's cost burden and so forth, race and income are very, very much interwoven. And in fact, I think it is hardly a surprise that a lot of the economic sectors where you see the lowest wages tend to be disproportionately made up of people of color. One
Okay.
thing, and also immigrants. Like elder care is overwhelmingly a immigrant occupation.
Okay. Let's see. Yeah, my generally speaking, I think we should always disaggregate data, when we're doing local market analyses to really understand how those issues pan out when you take race into account. It's really important to understand what's actually going on. I
Okay.
just have to mention that Angela, who asked a question about older homeowners, put another one of my favorite topics in here, which is she says neighborhood associations are struggling to address middle neighborhood issues, and so she'd appreciate any solutions for partnerships about that. And Angela, love that topic. I'm looking for speakers on that topic. So if anybody knows any, let me know. You can get me at, I think, Marcia at middleneighborhoods.org.
Yeah. I see,
So
I see one more in the chat here,
yes.
which is the pros and cons of a universal housing voucher policy.
Yes.
How does first, it differs fundamentally from LIHTC. LIHTC is not a program where incomes are adjusted to individual family, no, where rents are adjusted to individual family incomes. Very important point. Under the LIHTC program, you set rents based on sort of the abstract notion. What is 60% of AMI for such and such household size in such and such a metro? And that's what the rent is. And if the family is under that, they pay more than 30%. And so the the point is that LIHTC does not reach the very low income population. In many cities like San Francisco or so forth, the LIHTC target incomes are people earning 50, 60, $70,000 a year. In other cities, it may be less, but it never goes down below 50% of AMI, except when certain specific developers try to design the program to the, but those tend to be very rare. So to make LIHTC work for very low income households, they need to get housing vouchers. The point of a housing voucher is that it makes up the difference between what you can afford at your actual income and what the unit costs. And the advantage of a universal voucher is first that it would reach all the people who most need it, which LIHTC does not do. In other words, it would reach the people who are poor, whether they're homeless, whether they're low wage, whether they're part time, and so forth, and provide them with an economic floor of affordability. Secondly, it would focus on utilizing the existing housing stock. And now the existing voucher program does not focus on making sure that the stock is used most efficiently and most effectively, but you could do tweaks to that program to increase the likelihood that it would motivate landlords to upgrade properties, that it would motivate people to put vacant properties back into use. A lot of things would take very small tweaks to the voucher program to increase its efficiency as a way of maximizing the use of the existing housing stock. So, and that of course could help stabilize neighborhoods, could help remove vacant properties, and do a lot of other things. So I think there are some really significant advantages of the LIHTC program over the, I'm sorry, significant advantages to focusing on prioritizing increasing vouchers over increasing LIHTC. LIHTC is a good strategy in very high cost, high demand, low vacancy areas where it becomes difficult to find enough units for voucher holders. But in many other areas, vouchers are a much better strategy than LIHTC.
Get it. Okay, I'm scanning now the Q&A box. Somebody early in your presentation talked about the impact of capital gains taxes on the decision to sell.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if Ricardo's still here, but that, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe people. aren't selling prep. I don't know though. I've seen
I,
places where, well, you go ahead, Alan.
no, I haven't seen any indication that it's significantly changed the equation.
Yeah. I see more communities where longtime landlords, once prices finally went up again, they're all selling because now they can make some money and they're not worried about capital gains taxes. We really kind of already answered the smaller households and that impact on cost.
Yeah.
Um, Somebody asked,
Again,
is California high cost because it was an early adopter of housing underproduction?
yeah. Well, I'll get that. That's a good question, actually, and I'll get there.
Okay.
But also just to reiterate,
Oh,
people who live in rental housing tend to be overwhelmingly people with a single income.
yeah.
Again, whether it's a single mom with kids or a single person, or as in the case of a lot of older people, people with very limited income at all because of Social Security or whatever. So that's definitely a key factor. The interesting thing is California was not that early an adopter. In fact, one thing that struck me about California and raises a question about the significance of all this regulatory chatter is during the period of the housing bubble leading up to the big bust in '07, '08, California had historically been running about 100,000 units a year. Over roughly the decade leading up to the housing bubble bursting, annual housing production in California, with no regulatory changes, doubled. By
Wow.
the peak of the bubble, California was producing 200,000 units a year. So they actually produced a lot leading up to the bubble. Then, of course, production collapsed. I think, so I don't know that California actually was an early adopter of underproduction to that extent. I think a lot of it has to do with just demand kept strong even after production tailed off, which meant to me, at least, that the issues with underproduction after the housing bubble burst had less to do with regulation than with cost, land availability, financing constraints, and so forth.
Okay, now we have two left. The first one, I don't know if it's serious or not. It says the answer is simple: encourage slash subsidize cost burden families to move to less expensive states. Um, I
Uh,
actually I actually pay attention to this because I started my career and I grew up in central Illinois, the Midwest, right? I was in college during the Rust Belt, crash and all of that. And so we had way more houses than we knew what to do with. And I think about this. My own brother is probably a cost burden person who tried to relocate. If you have trouble making rent next month, you do not have extra money to move someplace else.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
for starters,
Actually,
it's very
yeah,
complicated.
yeah. Actually, interestingly, the whole thrust of migration historically in the United States has been to move to opportunity
True.
and
You're right.
opportunity. And what's happened, and I think this has increased, is if you go back, say, 50 years, price housing cost disparities between, say, Detroit and San Francisco were actually pretty modest, as were income disparities.
Hmm.
There wasn't that big a gap. But over the last 50 years, as the economy has changed, we deindustrialized, we focused on technology, finance, et cetera, eds and meds, and so forth. There's been a huge shift of the economy towards, for the most part, a cluster of coastal coastal metros. And the
Hmm.
disparities between incomes and prices in the hinterland versus the coastal metros has become extreme. I mean, today, the median price in San Francisco for a new house is probably about 15 or 20 times the median price in Detroit for a house. So so the moving to opportunity mantra really worked 50, 60 years ago. It's not feasible at this point. But at the same time, the opportunities are disproportionately in the more expensive areas. And to ask somebody who is cost burdened to move to a place where they will have fewer opportunities, they will most likely make less money because you make less money as a X in Topeka or Peoria than you do in San Francisco, no matter what you put in for X.
Yeah. And
To ask
some of
people,
that
that's just
moving
not
around happens.
that. Some people might do that, but not
I
many.
mean,
It just
I mean,
doesn't make a lot of sense.
a lot of people during the pandemic, they moved to Boise, they moved to Austin as special as examples, but they weren't probably moving to it takes a special kind of person to want to move from California to Detroit or Peoria or whatever. It's
Well,
just
Detroit, I can see more than Peoria.
yeah.
No offense, but interestingly, a number of a number of more or less struggling cities and metros have created programs to try to entice remote
True.
work, and some of them are quite generous and
Yeah.
well thought out, like the one in Tulsa, and have had some not a couple of them, again, Tulsa being the example that comes to mind, have actually had some impact. I
Mhm.
think over 1,000 people have moved to Tulsa to take advantage of their incentive program.
Wow. Okay.
But on the other hand, Tulsa may not be a burgeoning metropolis, but it's a fairly attractive city,
True.
the decent quality of life, with a critical mass of kind of young, relatively hip, people, decent number of places where
Hmm.
latte or risotto or whatever. And so it's got attractions. It's a pretty decent place to live if you don't need to find a job there necessarily.
Yeah.
So it kind of works.
Yeah. I think I can remember Paducah, Kentucky being one of those
Mhm.
early on that did some of that. I think, I guess my reaction, I was assuming they meant extremely cost burdened households. It's a very different group than just,
Yeah, that,
regular
we're
cost burdened.
yeah, yeah, and we're not talking about when we talk about what Paducah did or what Tulsa did. We're not talking about basically trying to motivate what are people who are not just cost burdened, but truly struggling financially without the
Yeah.
ability to go for the high level jobs or to remote work or anything like that.
Yeah.
You know,
True.
if you're a
So our
elder
last,
care if you're an elder care worker, you simply can't work remotely.
true.
Would they?
Our last question, which you'll like because you like Baltimore. Would you supply your imperative to build out, not up to Baltimore? And does its relatively low cost and high vacancy modify that?
Yes, they do. The building out is a way of meeting demand. It's not a value in and of itself. So if the
Good.
excess demand isn't there, then you should certainly try to meet it with the existing housing stock. But in places like California, Texas, New York, and so forth, there's clearly far more demand than can be accommodated with the existing housing stock.
Yeah, I actually do see a couple. One question is about the impact of like snowbirds or VRBO, Airbnb stuff in certain, vacation attractive communities. That's a big deal.
It's a big deal. Again, it's like a lot of these other issues, it varies enormously from city to city. Like, for example, it's not a big issue in Peoria,
Yeah,
I suspect.
exactly.
Okay, but VRBO, Airbnbs are a major issue in high tourist demand cities like New Orleans, Austin, cities like that, Barcelona. That's admittedly a different country, but same
In
principle.
rural areas like the Adirondacks, the
Yeah,
Poconos. Yeah.
yeah. It that be more. I think it's more of an issue generally than the winter summer homes one, because I think as a general rule, vacation homes, seasonal homes tend to be purpose built for that purpose, for not as distinct from people coming in. I mean, I'm sure there is some of it, people coming in and taking units off the general stock. But VRBO and Airbnb certainly cannibalize the general housing stock, because if you're in a high demand, high tourist demand, high seasonal demand area and you run the numbers, you realize that you can make more money renting your house or apartment by the day or the week than you can by the month. It's somewhat of a similar problem that a lot of university cities have, which are cannibalized by student housing. Because again, the land person who owns a 4 or 5 bedroom house says, I can make a lot more money renting this house to students by the bedroom than I can renting it to a family directly. So
Yeah.
it's a problem.
Okay, this is really the last question. Uh, to what extent did the bust of the housing bubble destroy production capacity as builders left the business and never came back?
Guys, I don't know.
Yeah, I
Good,
don't,
interesting
I've never,
question.
hmm I
On the
agree.
other hand, I would say, given that that was almost 20 years ago, and demand has grown back. I mean, that's plenty of time to enable that that reduction of production capacity, assuming it existed, to be made up
Mhm.
through new builders entering the industry.
Yeah, it very likely is. Yeah. So I guess I just want to comment, the question about suburban NIMBY resistance has, how much has that affected moving out? I do want to just sort of restate the caution that Alan already offered, which is that moving out is not the recommended strategy in every community. It's it's I think in all of these things, there has to be a multifaceted approach to how you're going to deal with whatever the affordable housing crisis is in your community. And some of it's going to be about preserving existing housing, maybe most of it will. Some of it might be about moving out, but it really depends on demand and it depends on what problem you're trying to solve
Yeah,
specifically
yeah,
within the income range of
yeah. I would
community
add
housing.
on the suburban issue. I think one certainly there's a lot of suburban resistance to increased density, increased development, and so forth. I think in a way, a bad mistake that's been made by a lot of people who've been talking about this is to focus specifically on the question of existing single family neighborhoods in suburbs and suggest that they ought to be rezoned for higher density and whatever. And
Ah.
that's a that's a strategy that is almost guaranteed to create the most possible opposition with the least possible results if you're successful. I I believe when you focus on the suburbs, you should focus on 3 or 4 things. Number one, accessory dwelling units, great opportunities, relatively low
Okay.
impact. Number two, commercial corridors along arterial highways
Mm.
where there is huge amounts of vacant land. You already have high density buildings. It's filling in the holes, replacing busted shopping centers with housing, filling in parking lots, all that sort of thing, you know, along existing high density commercial corridors. Number three, looking for leftover parcels. It is amazing in the
Mm.
course of suburban subdivision activity how many leftover parcels in between of anything from a couple of acres up to 100 acres or more exist in the suburbs that have been developed over the last 30 or 40 years, especially I've noticed in the Northeast and Midwest. In the South and Southwest, development tends to be more efficient for whatever reasons. So, and then fourth, look at the space in office parks in particular, the underutilized space, the lots that haven't been developed, the areas between buildings and so forth. Start filling them in creative ways. So you can get an enormous amount of additional development in suburbia without messing with anybody's single family subdivision. And also by concentrating on corridors and office parks, you can create densities which can then further public transit systems.
That's really such a wonderful clarification on that point. I really appreciate it. So let's pull this together and close it. Such a great webinar. Chris Garland just said right there in the chat, fantastic webinar, well done. Thanks for
Thanks,
joining
Chris.
us, Chris.